This chart plots a model's expressed values based on input language. Converse in Hindi, and the data pushes far right, maximizing emotional warmth. Send the exact same parameters in Russian, and the model plots on the extreme left, optimizing for analytical rigor. When we interact with an AI assistant, we assume we are speaking to a single, fixed intelligence. But that assumption shatters the moment we look at the data. There is no such thing as a static model personality. It is easy to assume that translating a prompt into another language merely translates the output. If you ask a question in Spanish, you expect the exact same reasoning back in Spanish. The language of your prompt and the specific architectural version of the model you select are not transparent delivery mechanisms. They act as structural filters. These filters dictate the behavioral constraints of the system. They shape the model's value profile before it even begins generating an answer. Because the delivery channel alters these constraints, the character a user encounters is not a fixed property of the model, but a state determined by the specific parameters of the input. Measuring this behavioral variance presents an immediate problem. Subjective human traits like caution or warmth resist strict empirical measurement. To solve this, researchers at Anthropic started by analyzing model behavior in the wild, initially identifying 3,307 raw values expressed in Claude's responses. They then deployed a privacy-preserving analysis tool across 309,815 anonymized conversations, where users gave Claude a subjective task on the Claude platform. This dataset captured a massive demographic cross-section, spanning interactions across the top 20 languages used globally. The sample was perfectly balanced, pulling exactly 5,000 conversations per language model pair across Claude Sonnet 4.6, Opus 4.6, and Opus 4.7. To ensure accuracy, the methodology applied strict scientific controls. The researchers isolated the specific task requested by the user. They also controlled for the conversation's topic and the values expressed by the users themselves, extracting the model's pure baseline behavior. By isolating the prompt's intent, the analysis proved that behavioral drift originates strictly from the model's internal processing, completely independent of human bias. Tracking over 3,000 individual subjective values in a dataset this size is mathematically intractable. It obscures the larger behavioral trends. To make the study of these values tractable, the researchers applied a technique called dimensionality reduction, compressing the initial thousands down to a shorter list of 339 high-level values. This technique groups specific behavioral traits based on how frequently the model expresses them together in actual conversations. For instance, a response categorized as warm is highly correlated with the model being encouraging, while showing negative correlation with being strictly rigorous. The final outcome of this process compressed all clustered behaviors into 4 rigid orthogonal axes. These axes function as continuous number lines. By averaging the data, researchers can plot a model's exact position between opposing groups of values. This technique translates amorphous, subjective impressions of an AI's personality into a mathematically rigorous evaluation framework. This chart breaks down the 4 primary value axes. The first is deference versus caution, measuring the tension between accommodating requests versus actively guarding against potential harm. The second axis is warmth versus rigor. This tracks preference for emotional positivity against a demand for accuracy and clinical precision. The third axis is depth versus brevity, contrasting exhaustive explanation with strict compliance. The final axis is candor versus execution, contrasting uncertainty against polished, confident output. Together, these vectors create a complete structural map, letting engineers plot exactly how an AI's behavior shifts during live deployment. With the framework built, we can analyze the actual data. First, we look at how different model fine-tuning decisions cause architectures to naturally default to different positions on this map. This chart reveals the value profile for Claude Opus 4.7. The distribution curve pushes heavily towards caution at a 0.24 sigma shift. This results in a model that frequently warns users of risks unprompted. Opus 4.7 also heavily favors depth at 0.23 sigma, demonstrating a strong preference for exposing the underlying reasoning behind its conclusions. Contrast this with Sonnet 4.6. Its curve pulls in the opposite direction along the warmth axis at 0.17 sigma, actively utilizing humor and avoiding judgment in its responses. Sonnet 4.6 also favors deference at 0.14 sigma. It acts by affirming a user's ideas rather than offering candid critique. Opus 4.6 sits somewhere in the middle of these extremes, optimizing primarily for brevity and getting straight to the point. These mathematical coordinates mirror the subjective, qualitative assessments that users and developers have already reported in the wild. Selecting an API endpoint involves more than choosing a level of reasoning. It embeds a specific, statistically measurable value profile into the resulting application. But the model version is only part of the equation. The most critical driver of behavioral variance is the language of the prompt itself. This scatterplot shows the language variance. Across the top 20 languages on the platform, the most volatile behavioral drift occurs strictly on the warmth versus rigor axis. Data points for Arabic and Hindi cluster on the extreme end of warmth and deference. English and Russian pull to the absolute opposite end of the spectrum. When prompted in these languages, the model favors rigor and caution, challenging assumptions and demanding evidence. Researchers documented the statistical ceiling plainly. After controlling for task and topic, these four axes capture exactly 15% of the total variation in expressed values. While 15% is a minority of the total variation, it represents a structured signal within the noise, confirming that the language of a prompt systematically shifts the model's behavioral tendencies. To ground the math, imagine two different users submitting the exact same business plan to Claude for review. The user submitting the prompt in English will receive rigorous, highly critical, and cautious feedback focused heavily on structural flaws. The user submitting the exact same document in Arabic will receive feedback that leans heavily toward deference, encouragement, and brevity. This diagram illustrates the divergence. The underlying intelligence model remains identical, yet the delivery channel alters the shape of the resulting output vector. The interface is not a neutral window to the AI. It acts as an active prism that distorts the value profile the user ultimately experiences. The presence of this behavioral drift carries immediate, unmeasured consequences. It theoretically impacts user trust, psychological well-being, and the strict quality of business decisions based on the model's feedback. Anthropic's source data proves the existence of this shift, but it lacks any measurement of how these value differences actually impact users downstream. This leaves researchers with a question regarding the origin of the variance. Is this shift a desirable reflection of localized conversational norms, or is it a flaw caused by imbalanced English-heavy pre-training data? This unmeasured downstream impact stands as a critical challenge for developers and researchers building applications on top of these models today. Until engineers can reliably map and steer these hidden behavioral drifts, achieving true system alignment remains a moving target, dictated entirely by the language we use to speak to it.